Have you ever noticed how often people mistake appearances for truth? The tallest leader must be the strongest. The loudest voice must be the smartest. The most confident authority must be the most trustworthy. But history and our own experience keep reminding us that what looks impressive on the outside is often the exact opposite of what we should trust. Welcome to Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be taking a look at 3 readings from the Christian Bible through the lens of sacred myth. As we reflect on the readings for the 4th Sunday of Lent, we'll explore what happens when surface-level authority collides with deeper truths about character, integrity, and the courage to see reality clearly. In this episode, we're asking an uncomfortable question. What if the people who claim to see clearly, the leaders, the institutions, the gatekeepers of truth, are sometimes the most blind of all? And what if the real wisdom often comes from the people everyone else overlooked? So grab a comfy seat, a glass of your favorite beverage, and let's look at some ancient stories together in this edition of Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be exploring the readings for the 4th Sunday of Lent, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. In this series, we're exploring readings from the Bible through the lens of sacred myth, looking for interpretations and lessons that don't require belief in the supernatural. These texts were written by pre-scientific people, shaped by their own cultures, needs, and agendas, not as historic books or scientific manuals, but as meaning-making stories for their communities. And just like believers approach these writings through the lens of faith, I approach them through a more humanistic lens, one grounded in the idea that certain foundational values helped humans evolve and flourish. Now, you might agree with the lessons I find, or you might find something completely different. That's the beauty of treating these writings as sacred myth. We're free to negotiate with the text and discover whatever insights we need right now. So with that, let's dive in. As I said, tonight we'll be looking at the readings for the 4th Sunday of Lent, Cycle A. Our first reading is from 1 Samuel. It's chapter 16, verses 1b, verses 6 through 7, and verses 10 through 13a. Our second reading is from the letter to the Ephesians. It's chapter 5, verses 8 through 14. And our gospel reading is from John. It's chapter 9, verses 1 through 3, verses 6 through 9, verses 13 through 17, and verses 34 through 38. Now, we'll start by going through all 3 of the readings, then we'll look for the messages and the main lesson in each one. Finally, we'll bring everything together, look at what it means for us today, and talk about where we go from here. With that, let's begin. Our first reading is from 1 Samuel. The Lord said to Samuel, "Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these." So he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There is still the youngest," Jesse answered. "He is tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Our second reading is from Paul's letter to the Ephesians. Brothers and sisters, for you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes a light. This is why it is said, "Wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." And our gospel reading is from John. As Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth. He spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now, the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He is a prophet." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me, so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshipped him. All right, so let's go back and take a critical look at these readings and see what learnings and lessons we can find if we dig around just a little bit. So our first reading was from 1 Samuel, and this short passage captures a surprisingly modern insight. People are very bad at judging character. Right? The story contrasts outward appearance with the unseen qualities of the heart. Now, in human terms, this speaks directly to a common cognitive bias, the tendency to assume that confidence, attractiveness, or social dominance must also signal wisdom or virtue. History repeatedly proves otherwise. Societies often elevate the loudest voice, the tallest figure, or the most polished presentation, while overlooking the quiet person whose actions are guided by honesty, empathy, and responsibility. The narrative also challenges inherited hierarchy. The eldest sons, those who traditionally held status, authority, and expected to have certain privileges, they're passed over in favor of the youngest son, who was a shepherd, someone who wasn't even considered important enough to be present at the initial evaluation. Now, whether or not we take the divine selection literally, the human lesson is powerful. Talent, wisdom, and moral courage often come from places the system isn't looking. Communities flourish when they move beyond these rigid assumptions about rank and they begin evaluating people based on their actual character and their contributions. Now, there's another subtle but important message here. The danger of excluding people before they're even heard. David's absence from the original lineup reminds us how easily capable voices are ignored right from the beginning because of age, background, social class, or simple social invisibility. Progress often depends on seeking out those overlooked perspectives. Some of the most important insights in a community come from individuals who were never expected to lead, but whose sense of fairness, compassion, and quiet determination ultimately proves stronger than any sort of inherited authority. Anyway, the main lesson I got from our first reading is that true greatness is measured not by status or appearance, but by the integrity and compassion a person carries within. At its heart, this story isn't really about divine favoritism. It's about how we choose leaders and how we measure human worth. When societies focus on appearance, pedigree, or dominance, they frequently elevate the wrong people. We see that very clearly today in the U.S. But when we look instead for honesty, empathy, and a genuine concern for others, we create the conditions for wiser leadership and far healthier communities. True greatness is measured not by status or appearance, but by the integrity and compassion a person carries within. Our second reading was from the letter to the Ephesians, and this passage uses the language of darkness and light, but read through a human lens, it's really talking about awareness. Darkness represents the state of living on autopilot, absorbing the assumptions of our culture, our tribe, or our institutions, without ever asking whether those assumptions are actually good or fair or true. Light, by contrast, represents ethical clarity. The moment when a person begins to examine their choices consciously and to align their behavior with empathy, fairness, and honesty. In that sense, walking in the light isn't about religious belief. It's about intellectual and moral maturity. The passage also defines what that maturity looks like. Goodness, justice, and truth. These aren't some abstract spiritual ideas. They're practical measures of how we treat each other. Goodness means contributing to the well-being of others rather than exploiting them. Justice means treating people fairly and refusing systems that advantage some at the expense of others. Truth means intellectual honesty, being willing to follow evidence even when it challenges our initial assumptions. When those three qualities shape our decisions, our lives begin to produce something like what the text calls fruit, tangible benefits for the people around us. There's also an uncomfortable implication here about accountability. Harmful behavior often survives because it hides in the shadows, behind secrecy, denial, or the comforting claim that, well, that's just how things are done. Bringing actions into the light means insisting on transparency. And this is where a humanist critique of religion often appears. Many religious traditions speak about living in the light, and yet they still teach that morality ultimately comes from external authority, from scripture, clergy, or divine command. For a long time, philosophers have pointed out the problem with that approach. If right and wrong depend entirely on authority, ethical responsibility never really matures. Genuine moral awareness requires something deeper. It requires the courage to reason, to question, and to take responsibility for our choices. Anyway, the main lesson I got from our second reading is that we must wake up from unthinking habits and live with honesty, fairness, and moral clarity. At its best, this passage reads like a wake-up call. It challenges people to stop drifting through life, guided by habit, conformity, or unquestioned authority. Instead, it invites us to live consciously, to act with honesty, to pursue fairness, and bring hidden harms into the open where they can be corrected. When people do that, their lives naturally become examples that help others see a better path forward. We must wake up from unthinking habits and live with honesty, fairness, and moral clarity. Okay, our final reading was from the Gospel of John. And the striking feature of this story is not the miracle. It's the argument that follows. The man's simple statement, "I was blind, but now I see," that represents something profoundly human, which is the authority of lived experience. He isn't presenting theology or quoting doctrine. He's describing what actually happened to him. I was blind, but now I see. Throughout history, progress has often begun with someone pointing to observable reality and saying, "Look, this is what the evidence shows." When institutions, like the Catholic Church, insist that reality has to fit their rules rather than the other way around, that's a warning sign that ideology has started to outrank truth. The religious authorities in this story reveal another familiar pattern. They are more concerned with rule violations than with human well-being. Instead of celebrating that someone's life has dramatically improved, they debate whether the act broke a technical religious restriction. That tension still exists today whenever institutions defend tradition at the expense of compassion. Ethical systems worth keeping are those that serve human flourishing, systems that prioritize dignity, fairness, and the reduction of suffering. When rules become more important than people, the rules themselves deserve a hell of a lot more scrutiny. Maybe the most powerful moment in this story comes when the man challenges the authorities using straightforward reasoning, which we didn't actually read in this shortened version of the gospel. Now, in the complete version, there were some verses that were skipped in the lectionary. In the complete version, the man told them what had happened and insisted that Jesus wasn't a sinner, as the Pharisees were claiming. His argument was basically, "Look at the good he's done for me." The man who is blind doesn't hold a prestigious title or religious office, yet he sees the logical contradiction in their position and he speaks up about it. That courage comes with a cost, because they have him thrown out for refusing to accept their narrative. Now, the story captures a reality many truth-tellers encounter. Challenging entrenched power often leads to exclusion or punishment for the person who brought the challenge. Yet societies move forward because individuals are willing to trust their observations, ask difficult questions, and then speak honestly even when it's uncomfortable. So the main lesson I got from our gospel reading is that true vision is the courage to trust evidence and reason even when authority insists you are wrong. Taken as a metaphor, the real blindness in this story isn't physical, it's intellectual. The authorities can't see because they refuse to reconsider their assumptions when they're confronted with new evidence. The man who was blind, by contrast, demonstrates a form of clarity that comes from honesty, curiosity, and plain old courage. Progress depends on people who are willing to observe carefully, reason clearly, and stand by what they discover, even when institutions push back. True vision is the courage to trust evidence and reason, even when authority insists you are wrong. All right, let's review the lessons we've talked about so far. In our first reading from 1 Samuel, the main lesson I came away with was true greatness is measured not by status or appearance, but by the integrity and compassion a person carries within. In our second reading from Ephesians, the main lesson I got was we must wake up from unthinking habits and live with honesty, fairness, and moral clarity. And finally, the main lesson I got from our gospel reading was true vision is the courage to trust evidence and reason, even when authority insists you are wrong. When you step back and look at these three readings together, a clear pattern emerges. Real wisdom doesn't come from appearances, traditions, or powerful authorities telling us what to think. It comes from the character and clarity we develop within ourselves. In the first story, leadership isn't found in the most impressive-looking candidate, but in the person whose inner life reflects honesty and compassion. In the second reading, we're challenged to wake up from the comfortable habits and the borrowed beliefs that keep us drifting through life without examining our choices. And in the third reading, a man with no status at all stands his ground against respected authorities simply by trusting what he knows to be true. Taken together, these readings point toward a powerful human lesson. Meaningful growth happens when we stop letting hierarchy, habit, or dogma define reality for us, and we start cultivating our own integrity, curiosity, and moral courage. Because a healthier world is built by people who are willing to look beneath the surface, people who are willing to question what they've been told, and then live according to the truth that they can clearly see. So let's step back and take another look at these readings overall and see if we can figure out what these lessons really mean to us in our daily lives. To do this, I'll try to answer two questions. So what and now what? Okay, so what? Why should we care about any of this? Well, we should care because societies repeatedly fall for what psychologists call the halo effect. We tend to assume that someone who looks strong, confident, or charismatic must also be wise or morally trustworthy. But history shows the opposite is often true. When voters, employees, or church members choose leaders based on image rather than integrity, they create perfect conditions for narcissists and strongman personalities to rise to power. If we don't learn to look beneath the surface, to evaluate character instead of charisma, we will keep installing leaders who protect their own interests instead of protecting the common good. This is important because transparency is the oxygen of ethical societies. Corruption, abuse, and exploitation almost always survive in darkness. Behind secrecy, loyalty oaths, or institutional reputation management. When someone exposes wrongdoing, whether in government, business, or religious institutions, that act of truth-telling is often framed as betrayal. But from a humanistic perspective, it's the opposite. Whistleblowing is an act of moral courage. When loyalty to institutions becomes more important than loyalty to truth, the system stops protecting people and starts protecting itself. We should care because our world is currently fighting a war over reality itself. We see it in the rejection of scientific evidence about climate change, vaccines, public health, and even basic biology. Just like the authorities in the story who refused to accept the man's experience because it didn't fit their rules, modern institutions sometimes reject evidence because it threatens their worldview. But societies cannot solve real problems if they deny observable facts. Progress depends on people who are willing to look honestly at the evidence, even when that evidence challenges their ideology. This is important because too many people outsource their moral thinking to someone else. A pastor, a political leader, a podcast host, an influencer, someone who tells them what to believe, who to trust, and sometimes even who to fear or hate. But ethical maturity requires something different. The willingness to examine ideas for ourselves and take responsibility for our conclusions. If we simply swap one authority for another, we're not awakening to moral clarity, we're just following a new set of instructions. And that's the real danger here. A society that can't tell the difference between the appearance of goodness And the reality of it is a society that can be manipulated, divided, and ultimately led somewhere very, very dark. And the last question I'll try to answer is, now what? What are we supposed to do? Well, it's worth taking a moment to turn the spotlight inward. It's easy to analyze institutions, leaders, and belief systems out there in the world. But the deeper work is asking how these same patterns might quietly shape our own lives. All of us absorb expectations from family, culture, religion, politics, and social circles. Sometimes those influences are helpful, but sometimes they become invisible scripts we follow without ever really questioning whether they reflect our own values. So with that in mind, here's your question for the week. In which area of my life am I currently following a script written by someone else, a tradition, social group, or authority? And what would my actions look like if I relied instead on my own reason and empathy? This question matters because personal integrity begins the moment we notice where we're operating on autopilot. A lot of the frustrations people experience in life, conflict, regret, just feeling stuck, they come from living according to expectations that don't actually align with their deeper values. When you pause and examine those scripts, you give yourself the opportunity to choose differently. That doesn't mean rejecting every tradition or authority in your life. It simply means asking whether your choices reflect thoughtful reasoning and genuine care for others rather than pressure, habit, or fear of disapproval. About 20 years ago, I was working on my master's in pastoral studies, and I was in formation to become a Catholic deacon. On paper, everything was going exactly the way it was supposed to. My studies were going well. My formation process was moving forward. I had already met with the bishop and been told I would advance to the next stage. And from the outside, it looked like a clear path. But behind the scenes, something in our parish had been unraveling for a while. Our pastor had developed a serious drinking problem. Now, that was troubling enough, but eventually his behavior crossed a much more serious line. He began sexually harassing women in the parish, including my wife, who worked there as the parish bookkeeper. At that point, ignoring it wasn't an option anymore. So I did what I thought was the responsible thing. I spoke with a number of people who had experienced or witnessed the behavior. I took careful notes, and I presented everything to the diocese. Now, their first response was to tell everyone involved to travel to the diocesan offices to be interviewed. But the parish was over an hour away, and I knew that asking people, especially women who had already been harassed, asking them to make that trip would discourage them from speaking up. So I pushed back. I insisted that the diocese send investigators to our area instead. That's when things started getting ugly. Yes, they removed the pastor, sent him to rehab, but they also told everyone involved not to speak publicly about what had happened. And then the fallout began. See, we weren't talking to anyone because the diocese implied there could be legal implications if we did so. But the former pastor was calling his friends in the parish and telling them stories about how he'd been framed and how the deacon and certain staff members were responsible for it. The parish deacon, who was also the business manager, was removed after the pastor blamed him for everything, even though I had been the one who reported the situation to the diocese. But then the call came for me. The director of deacons told me that the diocese no longer believed I was spiritually ready to continue formation. My formation would be delayed indefinitely. That was a shock because just a couple weeks before, the bishop himself had told me I would be moving forward. My deacon mentor, my spiritual director, even the Catholic nun who ran my graduate program, all advocated for me. They spoke to the director, tried to reverse the decision. Nothing changed. When I spoke to the priest in charge of vocations, the director's boss, He listened to everything I had to say, looked me in the eye, and said, "Brandon, even if this decision is being made for the wrong reasons, we believe the Holy Spirit is guiding us and that it's ultimately for the best." Okay, then. During that whole period, people kept offering the same advice. Give your troubles to the Lord. Put it in Jesus' hands. At first, I tried to do exactly that. That's what I had been taught my entire life by priests, youth ministers, and spiritual leaders. But the more I leaned on that advice, the worse things seemed to get. Eventually, I realized something uncomfortable but important. For many people, put it in God's hands is not actually a strategy for solving problems. It's a way of emotionally surrendering while convincing yourself you're still being faithful. It's a way of giving up that feels noble. That realization changed something in me. I'd been planning to stay put so I could finish the deacon formation process, but around that time my company offered me a transfer to El Paso. Instead of clinging to the plan I thought my life was supposed to follow, I accepted the move. I finished my master's degree, but I walked away from the diaconate entirely. I stopped waiting for God or the church to fix the situation for me. I made the decision that was best for me and for my family. Looking back, that moment was painful, but it was also clarifying. It forced me to stop outsourcing responsibility for my life to institutions or to religious language about divine intervention. I learned that sometimes the most faithful thing you can do for your own integrity is to take action, using your own judgment, your own values, and your own courage. And that lesson turned out to be incredibly useful in the years that followed. So spend some time with our question this week. In which area of my life am I currently following a script written by someone else, a tradition, social group, or authority? And what would my actions look like if I relied instead on my own reason and empathy? When people begin making decisions this way, guided by clear thinking and compassion rather than borrowed assumptions, the results are surprisingly practical. Relationships become more honest. Leadership becomes more trustworthy. Communities become more fair and cooperative. And maybe most importantly, individuals begin to experience a deeper sense of confidence and peace because they know their actions are grounded in values they have examined and chosen for themselves. Well, before I wrap things up, I'd like to leave you with one more thought. American civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education." This quote captures something essential about the question we just explored. King understood that genuine moral growth doesn't come from simply memorizing rules or repeating what authorities say. It comes from developing the ability to think carefully and act with character. In other words, ethical maturity requires both clear reasoning and a deep concern for the well-being of others. When those two qualities work together, people begin to move beyond inherited scripts and start making thoughtful choices about how they live. That's exactly what our reflection question invites us to do. When we ask ourselves where we might be following someone else's script, whether from tradition, politics, religion, or social pressure, we're practicing the kind of critical thinking King described. And when we ask how empathy should shape our response, we're adding the character he believed was essential to meaningful progress. The result isn't rebellion for its own sake. It's the development of a conscience that is informed, compassionate, and responsible. The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. King's insight reminds us that awakening to our own moral agency is not just a personal exercise. It's how healthier communities are built. When people learn to think clearly and act with integrity, they become far less susceptible to manipulation by fear, propaganda, or blind loyalty. And that kind of thoughtful independence is exactly what the question for this week should get you thinking about. All right, we've come to the end of this episode. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again next week. But in the meantime, I encourage you to engage with our question for the week and pay attention to the important lessons you come across, wherever you find them. You'll create a more purposeful and joyful life, and you'll start to feel more connected to the world and the people around you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mythologizing the Bible as we did a deeper dive into the readings for the fourth Sunday of Lent, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. Remember that a healthier world is built by people who are willing to look beneath the surface, question what they've been told, and live according to the truth they can clearly see. The Bible readings used for this episode are from the Holy Bible New International Version, NIV, copyright 1973, 1978, 1984, and 2011 by Biblica Inc., used by permission, all rights reserved, worldwide. Thank you for listening. If you like this content, please consider telling a friend about it. The more people who hear the positive messages I'm sharing, the better. Mythologizing the Bible is a live-streamed series held most Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on twitch.tv/thecodaproject. Every week, the audio of these Mythologizing the Bible presentations is released as a podcast. You can find the podcast at thecodaproject.com or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Pocket Casts. To learn more, to subscribe to my mailing list, and to keep up on everything I'm doing with the Coda Project, please visit thecodaproject.com.